First, we will hear from Mary and Zainab, who will focus on the issue of women in conflict, and then from Anne and Frank, who will discuss some more issues dealing with children in conflict. Mary?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I know that this particular subject of women, children, and conflict is very personal and very painful for a number of you in the room, a number of you who have worked in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia that was mentioned this morning, different places where you see directly the terrible toll and the impact. And we know the kind of statistics of over a short period in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 27,000 women and girls raped, the ones that had actually formally complained. And think of how many more were savagely affected in their bodies and had fistula problems and other problems probably for the rest of their lives. But do we really know the situation, even though I think we're a pretty informed audience in this room? Last September, I went with 7 other women, including Jane Wales, who's running our lives here, and 5 very strong, very admirable African women from 5 different African countries, and a former Minister of Justice from Germany. We were helped logistically by Oxfam. We went to Eastern Chad to listen to and take the stories and the voices of women that we would meet about themselves and their families, and then try and amplify them and augment them and put some political pressure on where it needed to be in relation both to Eastern Chad and to Darfur. One of the things that surprised me, I have to say surprised me, when we listened to these women, the terrible stories of how they'd had to run from their villages, as one woman said, men on horseback and planes from the sky. So direct government complicity. And one particular woman's story still stays with me. She was running from the village. She grabbed her twin babies and ran as hard as she could for as long as she could. And then in exhaustion, she put the babies down under a tree. And she said, well, I better go back and see what's happened to my husband and my other child, my older daughter. So she ran back to the village and found her husband had been killed, her daughter had been killed, and she was grabbed by 4 men, and they so violated her that physically she found it very difficult to get back to her twins, and then she had to get them across the border. And that was one of many similar stories. And those women in the refugee camp in Darfur, when we asked them what their priority was, they said, security, security, security. We're not safe here in the camp. We go out for firewood, we're raped. They even sometimes come into the camp. And we said, who are they? And they said, in uniform. It doesn't matter. It may be government, not well-trained troops who've come from the other side of Chad, a very large country. It may be rebel forces. That part of Eastern Chad has become, sadly, very like what we hear about in Darfur. And then we went to the internally displaced Chadian citizens, women and their families from villages 70 or 80 miles away who'd had to flee. And those internally placed camps were less secure, less well organized than the refugee camps. They just parked, and sometimes they were somewhere where in the rainy season they would get flooded out, and they weren't safe. And this was in their own country because of the same situation. But as we sat with them, the other, maybe not so much of a surprise, but still something very memorable was what Archbishop Tutu talked about yesterday when he was addressing us at the beginning of this forum. Do you remember he talked about the elders going to Darfur and the group of women whom they met? And then when he sort of posed a question, well, what would you do? That every hand went up. Every woman there had ideas about what, if only she was in a position to do, she would do. And we found the same in Eastern Chad. These were not passive victims with their families. These were women who wanted to be part of the peace talks, who wanted to organize in such a way that this would be the case. And indeed, since that visit and the elders' visit to Darfur, the elders have been following the situation in Darfur and widely in Sudan. There is a wonderful group of women from throughout Sudan who are being supported by FAM Africa Solidarity under Binti Diop, who was one of the women who came with us to Eastern Chad. They've already gone to the African Union in January and made their case there. They went to the Human Rights Council in Geneva recently. They've talked to Salim, the African Union peace negotiator, and they're trying to possibly have another forum in July, which some of us may go back to encourage this. These are part of women in conflict, what women themselves are trying to do. But then we must ask ourselves, why is it that there are such terrible stories of women being victims in the sense of weapons of war against themselves and their communities, rape as a weapon of war? And why, despite the seriousness of the problem, does it get so little visibility? And Somalia is a good example of that. It has faded from the headlines, even though the suffering there is probably worse than it's been since I was there in 1992 as President of Ireland and was shocked at the way in which the conflict was preventing food getting to the feeding stations. Twice last year, I was in Kenya, no, 3 times I was in Kenya for very good events, including a huge conference in July about women and HIV and AIDS, organized by one of our participants here, Musimbi Kanyoro, when she was still Secretary General of the YWCA. And we spoke to quite a large group of women. There must have been about 100 women who came because they were there for the conference, but we were talking about situations of conflict and what we might do about it. And the strongest women in the room were the Kenyan women, because this was their home base, they had a secure country more or less, etc. I was back after our visit to Chad. I happened to be in Nairobi, and I reported back to about 35 women who were the Kenyans who'd come to that earlier, larger meeting, and told them about the visit, and we talked together about Somalia and Zimbabwe, how we might help women. I met a number of those women recently at the Commission for the Status of Women in New York, those Kenyan women, and I saw in their eyes what they have gone through, the trauma of recent conflict, the fact that suddenly their country, their community was imploding. One of them, a good friend, the Honourable Phoebe, said to me, she said, and it's terrible for the widows and the women who are living alone, because they either pay protection or they pay with their bodies. And she said, we haven't seen this in Kenya. And people burned in churches, and there was that shock and sense of absolute dismay. But those women also are linking together. In that room in New York, you had MPs of different parties, you had a woman bishop, you had women in Action Aid and other local NGOs and international NGOs who were helping, and they are building their strength as women. Graça Michel was there with Kofi Annan on behalf of the elders in the African Union as part of the mediation team, and Graça has encouraged this broad linking of women, and again we're going to try and support them. And this was the sort of background to a thinking about how we become more effective in responding to a reality that shames us. It frankly shames us, the impact on women and children of conflict, and the amount of it and the scale of it and the unacceptable savagery and brutality of it. What were we going to do about it? And I'm going to just refer briefly to 2 summits of women leaders that are now becoming linked together, that are showing a different approach, building on the kind of examples we've been getting from different places. And Realizing Rights, my organization, is a small part of a kind of catalytic bringing together of this. The first was a summit last November in New York, which was brought together by 4 organizations, the Annenberg Foundation being the 4th funding this summit and funding a follow-up to this summit to make us more practical. And 75 women leaders came to that summit, including a number of women, including Anne Veneman, who's on the panel with me here. And the website, because I don't want to go on too long about it, is www. and then all one word, womenandglobalsecurity.org. We broke security into 4 areas: combating acts of terrorism, responsibility to protect, economic insecurity, and the insecurity of climate change. And we were looking at the impact in particular of women and their families under those 4 headings. For example, under responsibility to protect, we particularly looked at gender-based violence and felt it's not enough, it's not surfaced enough, and I'm glad to say that Realizing Rights and the International Crisis Group are working together to have a stronger gender perspective on responsibility to protect. On the economic insecurity, we decided to do something measurable, to actually put ourselves in a position where people could come and say, you said you'd do this, And did we or didn't we? And that was to support the first African elected head of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She had sent a very strong video to our meeting, and we will work with her on the situation in Liberia itself as a post-conflict country. It said that approximately 80% of the women in Liberia were raped during the conflict. Think about that, building a society, regrouping on all of that. And Ellen, understandably, has put empowering women and youth, boys and girls, at the heart of her own government policy. And she's also hosting, on the 7th and 8th of March of 2009, an international symposium on empowering women and girls, because she wants Liberia to be a country that will really focus on that. And I'm glad to say there are a number of you here who are helping in Liberia, and I think we should try and concert together as much as possible in doing so. But this conference committed to that. We had our call to action, and we now have the report of the conference, and we've begun work. Several of us have had colleagues in Liberia. I have one there at the moment. The second conference, which began completely unrelated to the first one, wasn't looking at security. It was looking at poverty and saying the way to tackle poverty in the 21st century is to focus on women and girls. And the way in which this is going to be a breakthrough summit, which will take place in Washington, D.C. on Sunday and Monday next, and a number of people from here will be going there, is by bringing together 3 streams of very valuable activity. Oops, I'm out of time. I'll be very, very quick about this. 3 streams of activity on what the faith-based organizations do, what women's organizations do, and what development organizations do. And I'll just give you the reference to it, www.wfd-alliance.org, WFD for Women, Faith and Development. About 2,000 people will gather in the Washington Cathedral, and about 130 plus organizations of faith-based women and development will work on Monday on not talking about the problem, but talking about what do we do about it? What do we do practically? And one of the things will be, again, linking with Liberia, deciding on visits to places of poverty to support locally. And above all else, the funding. The shocking thing is that women's organizations and the priorities that women decide on are the most underfunded of all the activities in the world. I'm told that women's activities worldwide get about $100 million funding a year. $100 million for the whole world for women's organization funding. I'm not talking about funding for donor programs in other areas like health or education or something, but actual women's priorities. Think about that. Thank you very much.